He spit on the Virgin Mary during a holy procession. Thousands watched. Millions saw it online. And just 6 months later, the same man lay dying in a hospital bed, whispering her name. This is not fiction. This is what happened when a firebrand preacher, known for his brutal sermons and hatred of Catholic icons, crossed a line he could never take back. And how, in the final hours of his life, he found peace not through thunderous preaching, but through the silence of the very woman he mocked. Now, here's what really happened. Like, comment and share this video if it moves you. And tell us in the comments, do you believe in redemption? And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that reveal the power of mercy, healing, and unexpected grace. December 12th, 2013. Corpus Christi, Texas. The streets pulsed with candlelight and Spanish hymns as thousands gathered for the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Barefoot pilgrims carried framed images of the Virgin close to their hearts. Children in white dresses walked with their abuelas. The air smelled of roses and prayer. Then it happened. An elderly woman named Doña Esperanza Cruz, 80 years old and walking barefoot, clutched a small image of the Virgin against her chest. Her grandson Miguel lay dying of leukemia in the children's hospital. With each painful step on the cold asphalt, she whispered the same prayer. Virgencita, just give him peace. Just peace. That's when she saw him. Reverend Daniel Matthew Stone stood at the edge of the procession route, megaphone in one hand, worn Bible in the other. At 54, with steel-grey eyes and a voice that could crack thunder, he was the most feared evangelical preacher in South Texas. His church, Sword of Truth Revival, had grown from 12 believers in a mechanic's garage to over 2,000 members who hung on his every word. For years, Daniel had made war on what he called Catholic idolatry. Every feast day, he and his followers would line the processional routes with signs reading, "Mary can't save you," and "Worship Jesus, not idols." They weren't violent, just persistent, intentional, designed to pierce hearts already tender with faith. But this December night felt different, electric, dangerous. As Doña Esperanza passed, Daniel stepped forward. His voice boomed over the crowd. "That Virgin won't save your grandson. She doesn't exist." The procession slowed, heads turned, phone cameras rose. Then Daniel did something no one expected. He spit, not at the woman, but toward the image in her weathered hands. The sound was soft. The moment was explosive. Gasps rippled through the street like a shockwave. Someone screamed, "Blasphemia!" Another voice cried, "Call the police!" But Doña Esperanza said nothing. She simply knelt on the cold pavement, still clutching the Virgin's image, and whispered words that would haunt Daniel Stone for the rest of his life. "Forgive him, Holy Mother. He doesn't know what he's doing." Within hours, the video was online. Within days, it had 4 million views. To some, it was prophetic boldness. To others, the vilest act of religious hatred they'd ever witnessed. Even Protestant leaders across Texas distanced themselves from the incident. But for Daniel Stone, it was a holy stand. He was just being honest, his deacon Eric Morales said later. Truth offends, and Jesus said it would. What no one knew, not even Daniel, was that the moment he spit at Mary would become the first stone on a road that would shatter his body and remake his soul. Because 6 months later, the man who declared war on the Mother of God would be whispering her name in the darkness, begging not for a miracle, but for mercy. Long before Reverend Daniel Stone became the most hated preacher in South Texas, he was just Danny, a quiet boy growing up 3 blocks from Sacred Heart Catholic Parish. His mother, Rosa Elena Stone, was a third-generation Mexican-American who had converted to Catholicism when she married his Anglo father. Every night without fail, she would light a votive candle beneath a faded print of Our Lady of Guadalupe that hung above their fireplace. "La Virgencita always listens," she would whisper to Danny before bed, "even when no one else does." Danny believed her completely. As a child, he prayed with desperate earnestness for good grades, for his father to stop drinking, for the shouting matches to end, and most of all, for his mother's health to improve. Rosa had been sick for years with what doctors called an undiagnosed autoimmune disorder. It left her exhausted, aching, and eventually bedridden. But she never stopped praying. Every morning, despite the pain that racked her joints, she would reach for her rosary and whisper Ave Marias through cracked lips. Danny would kneel beside her bed, listening to the cadence of her prayers like a lullaby. He was 14 the night she died. The candle had burned low. The house fell silent, except for the steady beep of her heart monitor. When it flatlined, Danny collapsed to his knees in front of the Virgin's image and waited. He waited for something, a miracle, a sign, a whisper, anything. Nothing came. No warmth, no movement in the candlelight. Only the terrible, crushing silence of unanswered prayer. At the funeral, he refused to speak. At the burial, he refused to pray. "Where was she when Mom needed her?" he muttered when no one was listening. "Where was God?" Over the next few years, something hardened inside him like scar tissue. He still attended Mass out of obligation to his grandmother, Abuela Carmen, who had taken him in. But his heart had turned to stone. He watched with growing resentment as she kissed her medallion of Mary, as she whispered novenas into the morning light, as she lit candles for the dead who couldn't light them for themselves. The breaking point came when he was 17. After Sunday Mass, Abuela Carmen had invited him for lunch. She was frail but cheerful, setting out homemade tamales and fresh tortillas like it was Christmas morning. After the meal, she returned to her prayer corner, the same makeshift altar that had once belonged to his mother. Danny stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her arthritic fingers work the rosary beads. Then something inside him snapped. He walked over, grabbed the framed image of the Virgin, and without a word, hurled it into the backyard where it shattered against the concrete wall. Glass sparkled in the afternoon sun like broken promises. His grandmother screamed. "It's just paper and paint," he yelled, his voice breaking. "God doesn't live in pictures." Carmen didn't reply. She just closed her eyes, whispered a prayer he couldn't hear, and never spoke to him again. She died 2 years later. Danny didn't attend the funeral. But that same week, he found something tucked under his apartment door, a bright red flyer with bold letters, "Jesus saves alone." He almost threw it away. Instead, he read it 3 times. That night, for the first time since his mother's death, he opened a Bible. Not the Catholic edition with its elaborate footnotes and commentary, but a simple King James version he'd bought at a thrift store. He read straight through the Gospel of John, lingering on words that seemed to burn off the page. "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Not through Mary, not through saints, through Jesus alone." That was the spark. What followed was a wildfire. By 25, Danny had joined Cornerstone Bible Church, a small, non-denominational congregation that met in a converted auto shop on the outskirts of town. Within months, he was teaching youth Bible studies. Within years, he was preaching Sunday sermons that packed the makeshift sanctuary. His message wasn't just about salvation. It was about liberation from what he now saw as spiritual bondage disguised as tradition. At 29, he changed his name from Danny to Daniel Matthew and launched Sword of Truth Revival Church. The name itself was a declaration of war. Truth cuts. Truth divides. Truth destroys what is false. His early sermons were surgical strikes against Catholic doctrine. He didn't just preach against Mary. He dissected the theology surrounding her with the precision of a scholar and the passion of a convert. Using PowerPoint slides, historical documents, and carefully chosen scripture verses, he built airtight arguments against what he called the Marian heresy. Mary was blessed, yes. He would thunder from his steel platform, Bible raised like a weapon. But she's not your mediator. She's not your mother. She's not divine, and she is not listening. The church grew explosively. Former Catholics filled the plastic chairs, drawn by Daniel's promise of freedom from what he called religious slavery. They came seeking answers for their own unanswered prayers, their own seasons of silence, their own moments when the Virgin seemed to look away. Carmen Vasquez was one of his earliest converts. Her husband had been an alcoholic for nearly a decade. She had prayed novenas to Mary for years, lighting candles, walking barefoot in processions, begging for intervention. Nothing changed. But the moment she gave her life to Christ alone, no statues, no saints, no intercession except Jesus, her husband got clean. It wasn't Mary, she testified during a Wednesday night service. It was Jesus. Mary was holding me back. Christ set me free. Stories like Carmen's became Daniel's ammunition. They proved his point. Mary is a spiritual dead end. Christ is the only way forward. But not everyone was convinced. In fact, the larger the church grew, the more resistance it faced from the Latino Catholic community that surrounded it. Across town, Father Miguel Rodriguez at Sacred Heart Parish watched the exodus with weary eyes. He's not just attacking our doctrine, Father Rodriguez told a diocesan reporter. He's attacking our families, our culture, our mothers. The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. During major Catholic feast days, Daniel would organize what he called freedom walks, countermarches that shadowed Catholic processions. His congregation would dress in plain clothes and carry signs reading, "No Queen in Heaven but Christ the King," and "Don't kneel to images, stand in truth." They weren't violent. They didn't shout. But their presence was intentionally disruptive, designed to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of the faithful. Year after year, the spiritual war escalated. Daniel's sermons grew sharper. His followers grew bolder. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the quiet boy who once prayed beside his dying mother became a man who preached against her final comfort. The collision was inevitable. It just took one December night for the world to witness it. 6 months after the spitting incident, 6 months after the viral video that made Daniel Stone the most notorious preacher in America, something was wrong. It started small. Forgotten words during sermons, a tremor in his left hand while turning Bible pages, headaches that aspirin couldn't touch. His wife Sarah noticed it first. Daniel would stand in their kitchen at 2 in the morning, staring at the wall like he was reading invisible words. Once, she found him holding a coffee mug like it was a microphone, moving his lips soundlessly. "Just tired," he kept saying. "It's spiritual warfare. Nothing more." But then came the Sunday when his body gave out completely. He was mid-sermon, pacing the edge of the platform as he always did, when he suddenly gripped his skull and collapsed in front of 800 people. The sanctuary erupted. Gasps, screams, rushing feet. Someone called 911. Others fell to their knees in prayer. Sarah ran to the platform where her husband lay motionless, his eyes wide and unfocused, his lips twitching with words no one could understand. At Corpus Christi Medical Center, scans were taken and blood was drawn. 3 days of silence followed. On the 4th day, Dr. Elena Ramirez, a neurologist with 25 years of experience, entered the room holding a clipboard and wearing the expression of someone who had delivered devastating news too many times. "Mr. Stone," she began carefully, "you have a tumor. It's called glioblastoma multiforme, one of the most aggressive brain cancers we know. It's located in your left frontal lobe." Daniel didn't flinch. He simply stared, his eyes unreadable. Sarah gasped. "What does that mean?" "Without treatment, you may have 3 months. With surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation, we could extend that to 12, maybe 15 months. But I need to be honest, the 5-year survival rate is less than 5%. Heavy silence filled the room like smoke. Later that night, while the city hummed with its usual chaos, Daniel Stone, the man who had spent 20 years proclaiming that Jesus heals all who believe, stared at the ceiling tiles and felt completely abandoned. "Why now?" he whispered to the darkness. "Why when the ministry is thriving? Why when thousands hang on my every word?" He had preached revival in dozens of churches, cast out demons in prayer lines, led hundreds to salvation. He had stood firm when others called him a fanatic. He had spit at Mary and proclaimed Christ without apology. So why was his body betraying him now? That night, when Sarah returned from the hospital chapel, she found him weeping. Not from physical pain, but from spiritual confusion. "I've spent my life shouting for God," he said, voice broken, "and now he won't answer." She held his hand, unsure whether to offer scripture or silence. "Maybe," she finally whispered. "This isn't punishment. Maybe it's a door." "A door to what?" "To see what happens when you stop shouting and start listening." The hospital lights never truly went out. Even at 3 in the morning, they hummed softly through the blinds, casting a sterile glow over Daniel's gaunt face. The morphine dulled the pain, but not the questions. And it was in those long, merciless nights, when the prayers had stopped coming from his lips and started echoing only in his mind, that the ghosts began to return. Not demons, memories. The image that haunted him most wasn't the tumor on the MRI scan, but his grandmother Carmen kneeling at her makeshift altar, whispering Ave Marias with a peace that now seemed unreachable. He had hated that peace once. He had shattered her virgin against concrete and called her foolish, blind, lost. Now he lay in a hospital bed, whispering to a God he could no longer feel. Sarah noticed the change first, not in his body, which was already failing, but in his tone. He wasn't angry anymore, she later recalled. Just hollow, like all the fire had turned to smoke. One night, while feeding him ice chips because solid food had become impossible, she asked gently, "What are you thinking about?" Daniel stared out the window. The city beyond was quiet, wrapped in the velvet darkness of pre-dawn. "Do you remember when I smashed Abuela's altar?" Sarah hesitated. "I do. I told her it was just clay and paint," he whispered, "but she cried like I'd broken a piece of her soul." Silence stretched between them like a prayer. Maybe I did. That confession cracked something deeper than any sermon he had ever preached. Over the next few days, Daniel spoke less about miracles and more about regrets. He remembered Maria Sandoval, the Catholic mother whose son Roberto he had turned against her faith. He remembered the night Roberto smashed his mother's nativity set with a baseball bat, screaming that it was idolatry, just like Pastor Stone had taught him. He remembered Carmen Vasquez, the woman who had denounced Mary with such passion because he had convinced her to. He remembered the day he spit toward that elderly woman's image of the Virgin and told her God wasn't listening. What if he had been wrong? What if the people he dismissed as idolaters had simply found God through a different window? That thought shook him more than the cancer. Because if that were true, if the Virgin was not an enemy, but a mother to the broken, then he had spent his life declaring war on love itself. Nurse Angela Martinez, who had worked in oncology for over a decade, noticed how patients nearing death often spoke in loops. The same faces, the same phrases, over and over. But Daniel Stone didn't loop. He unraveled. One morning, as she changed his IV bag, she heard him whisper something that stopped her cold. "Virgencita, did you ever pray for me?" Angela, a devout Catholic herself, stood perfectly still. She didn't speak. She just watched as a man who once claimed Mary was nothing more than a myth wept silently into his pillow. His congregation didn't know. They still gathered in the hospital chapel, praying loudly for healing, declaring victory over cancer, fasting for breakthrough. They wanted the Daniel Stone who cast out demons, who stood at pulpits and pointed fingers at false religion. But that man was gone. In his place was a dying preacher, staring into his own legacy like evidence in a trial. "I taught people to hate," he told Sarah one night, "and I wrapped it in scripture." She didn't argue. She didn't say he hadn't. She simply held his hand and whispered, "Maybe now you get to teach them something else." The tumor was growing. The scans confirmed it. But something else was growing too. A question not about God's existence, but about his voice, and whether it sometimes came through people he'd been too proud to listen to. For Daniel Stone, the firebrand who once screamed that Mary was a lie, the real torment wasn't the cancer. It was the possibility that the woman he'd hated most had been quietly loving him all along. And maybe, just maybe, she still was. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Maria Sandoval knocked on the hospital room door. The halls were quiet, except for the soft squeak of nurses' shoes and the distant hum of machines keeping people alive. Outside, a pale Texas sun filtered through autumn clouds. Inside, Daniel Stone lay propped against white pillows, smaller now than his reputation, frailer than his voice had ever been. Sarah answered the door. The woman standing there was barely 5 feet tall, her greying hair pulled back in a neat bun, her weathered hands folded around a simple wooden rosary. She wore a faded blue cardigan and carried a familiar object tucked under her arm, a small framed image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. The glass cracked, but the image still clear. "My name is Maria," she said softly, her accent thick with years and sorrow. "I'd like to see the pastor." Sarah hesitated. She knew who this was. Maria Sandoval, the woman whose son Roberto had once torn her family's nativity scene apart with a baseball bat after joining Daniel's church. The woman who had collapsed with chest pains the night her family fell apart. The woman whose name had come up in Daniel's bedside confessions more than once. Still, Sarah stepped aside. Daniel's eyes fluttered open as Maria entered. He blinked twice, his vision blurred from chemotherapy, but he knew her face. It had been years since he'd seen her, not since that Sunday when she'd stood outside his church begging Roberto to come home. "Senora Sandoval," he rasped. She didn't let him finish. "I'm not here for apologies, Pastor," she said gently, settling into the chair beside his bed. "I'm here because I heard you were dying, and I wanted you to know. I've been praying for you." The room held its breath. Even the machines seemed quieter. Daniel blinked again, confusion clouding his fever-bright eyes. "Why?" he whispered. "After everything, after what I taught your son to do, why would you pray for me?" Maria leaned forward and placed the small image on his bedside table, right next to the water pitcher and the morphine pump. "Because," she said simply, "you are still someone's son, someone's husband, someone who once believed he was doing the right thing." She paused, her fingers tracing the wooden frame. "And because I believe in a God who never stops hoping we'll come home." Daniel's lips quivered. He turned his face away, but tears leaked from the corners of his eyes. "I destroyed your peace. I turned your son against you." "No," Maria said firmly. "You tried. But peace rooted in love survives even the loudest hatred." He looked at the image now. Mary's downcast eyes, her folded hands, her cloak of stars faded but still visible. "I taught hundreds of people to mock that face," he whispered. Maria reached over and gently placed her palm on the back of his trembling hand. "And I forgive you." There were no trumpets, no dramatic music, only the steady hum of the oxygen concentrator and the soft murmur of passing nurses. But something cracked in that room. A wall built from years of pride, sermons, theological certainty, and fear finally buckled under the simple weight of mercy. Sarah wept quietly in the corner. Before leaving, Maria stood and looked at him one last time. "I didn't bring the Virgencita to convert you, Pastor. I brought her so that if you feel alone, you'll remember that mothers never stop praying, even when their children forget how to pray for themselves." Then she smiled, not out of victory, but out of peace, and walked out of the room, leaving behind the faint scent of roses and something that felt like absolution. That night, Daniel didn't cry out to heaven. He didn't beg for healing. Instead, he whispered 2 words into the silence. "Thank you." No one knew whether it was to Maria or the Virgin, or maybe even to God himself. But for the first time in months, he slept without nightmares. Something shifted after Maria's visit. The small framed image remained on Daniel's bedside table, and its presence seemed to soften the harsh edges of the hospital room. For days, he said little. He didn't ask for the latest lab results or request stronger pain medication. Instead, he asked Sarah for something unexpected, a notebook. She brought him one, leather-bound with a ballpoint pen tucked inside the spine. "What's it for?" she asked. Daniel looked at her, his voice thin but steady. "For things I should have said years ago." And so, with trembling hands and morphine clouding the edges of his thoughts, he began to write. The first letter was to Roberto Sandoval. "Roberto, I once told you that loving Christ meant destroying what your mother cherished. I called it courage. I see now it was pride. A real man doesn't have to choose between faith and family. I made you believe you did. I was wrong, completely wrong. For that, I beg your forgiveness. Your mother is a woman of great faith. Honor her. Learn from her. The virgin she prays to. Maybe she really does listen. I'm no longer sure she doesn't. Pastor Stone. He folded the note with shaking fingers and handed it to Sarah. Make sure it gets to him. The second letter took longer. It was to his congregation, and the weight of 20 years of ministry pressed down on every word. He stared at the blank page for over an hour, as if all those sermons, baptisms, and altar calls were holding the pen frozen in his hand. Finally, he began. To my brothers and sisters at Sword of Truth Revival. For 20 years, I taught you that purity of doctrine required the rejection of others. I mistook loudness for truth and anger for righteousness. In trying to defend Christ, I forgot how he loved. If I ever made you believe that hating Catholics was faithfulness, I was wrong. If I taught you that mocking Mary was worship, I led you astray. Christ doesn't need us to divide his body. He died to unite it. The cancer in my brain isn't God's punishment. It's his mercy. It made me quiet enough to finally hear what I'd been shouting over for years. That love is louder than doctrine, and grace is wider than our understanding. Don't let my mistakes become your legacy. Build bridges, not walls. Pastor Daniel, a sinner saved by grace. Sarah posted it to the church's social media that evening. By midnight, it had been shared 8,000 times. Some followers were shocked. Some were angry. Others, like Carmen Vasquez, wept as they read it. He's still my pastor, she told a local reporter. But now he's also my brother. The third letter was the hardest. It wasn't addressed to the living. Abuela Carmen, they say the dead don't read letters, but if your soul is anywhere near heaven, maybe you'll hear this. I broke your altar. I mocked your prayers. I thought your faith was weakness, but you had something I lost trying to be right all the time. Peace. The cancer is taking my mind piece by piece. But in the quiet moments, I remember how you used to whisper to your virgin, not shouting like I did from pulpits, but whispering like a child to her mother. I think I understand now. Faith isn't about being loud. It's about being loved. If you see the lady in blue stars, the one you whispered to through tears, tell her that the boy who threw her picture is sorry. Tell her, I finally know what it means to be held. Your grandson, Danny Sarah, tucked that letter into the small wooden box where they kept Carmen's prayer cards and rosary. The things Daniel had once thrown away, but she had secretly saved. Word of Daniel's letters spread far beyond Corpus Christi. A Catholic radio host read them on air. A pastor in El Paso shared them with his congregation. Even Father Rodriguez, the priest Daniel had once publicly debated, called Sarah with a simple request. May I visit him? When he arrived, the two men, once warriors in a theological battle, spoke not as enemies, but as two travelers worn down by years of fighting. I was too proud to listen, Daniel admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I was too quick to judge, Father Rodriguez replied. We both forgot that truth without love is just noise. Before leaving, the priest took Daniel's hand. Pastor, he said gently, maybe God didn't allow this illness to punish you, but to let the walls fall down. Daniel smiled through cracked lips. Then let's not rebuild them. In the weeks that followed, the notebook remained beside him, filling slowly with names, thoughts, prayers. He didn't call them confessions. He called them repairs. And one by one, bridges that had been burned were quietly rebuilt, not with sermons or theology, but with two words he had rarely used from the pulpit. I'm sorry. No one expected the video to go viral. It was recorded on a quiet Thursday afternoon in Daniel's hospital room. Sarah set up her phone on a tripod. Father Rodriguez sat in a simple black shirt and collar, and, lying in the bed, connected to IV lines and surrounded by the constant hum of monitors, was a man barely recognizable as the firebrand who had once filled auditoriums. His voice was weak, but his words carried the weight of a lifetime. To the members of Sword of Truth Revival, and to the faithful of Sacred Heart. Parish. For years, I preached division in the name of truth. I see now that I mistook volume for conviction, and in doing so, I hurt good people, faithful people, People who loved God in a different way than I did. I was wrong. Father Rodriguez leaned forward. As a Catholic priest, I too carried resentment. I allowed anger to cloud compassion. We both believed we were defending God when we were really defending ourselves. The two men looked at each other, not with rivalry, but with the quiet recognition of shared wounds. Today, Daniel continued, his breathing labored, we lay down our swords, not because doctrine doesn't matter, but because love matters more. If Christ prayed that we might be one, who are we to pray for anything less? They ended with prayer, not as Protestant and Catholic, but as sons of the same Father. The video was posted that evening. By midnight, it had been shared over 100,000 times. By the end of the week, national news outlets had picked it up. A pastor's dying wish, unity, headlined one story. Two faiths, one forgiveness, read another. But the real transformation didn't happen online. It happened in Corpus Christi. The following Sunday, something extraordinary occurred at Sacred Heart during the 10 a.m. Mass. A group of visitors quietly entered through the side doors, men in jeans and button-down shirts, women in simple dresses, some clutching Bibles, others carrying nothing but uncertain smiles. They were members of Sword of Truth Revival. At the same moment, across town, a group of elderly Catholic women in lace mantillas walked into the back rows of Daniel's Warehouse Church. No one organized it. No one announced it. It just happened, as if the walls between the two congregations had simply dissolved. Roberto Sandoval was among those who came to Sacred Heart. He sat beside his mother for the first time in 8 years, his hands trembling as he knelt during the consecration. Afterward, he approached Father Rodriguez with tears streaming down his face. I want to ask forgiveness, he said, voice shaking. To my mother, to this community, to Mary, whom I judged without knowing her story. From across the sanctuary, Maria stepped forward. I never stopped praying for you, mijo, she whispered. Even when you broke my heart, I never stopped. They embraced, and in that simple moment, years of theological warfare crumbled into dust. For weeks, both congregations continued crossing thresholds they never thought they would. Joint food drives replaced competing outreaches. Prayer walks brought together voices that had once shouted past each other. Children from both churches played together in the same dusty parks where their parents had once avoided eye contact. Even the mayor of Corpus Christi issued a statement calling it an unprecedented example of spiritual reconciliation in modern America. What no one could deny was this. It started with a man who had once spit at a sacred image and ended with him, kneeling beside it, not in defeat, but in discovery. It was November 2nd, Dia de los Muertos, when Daniel Stone woke just before dawn. The hospital room was silent except for the soft beep of monitors and the distant sound of church bells ringing across Corpus Christi. Outside, marigolds lined the sidewalks as families prepared to honor their dead. Inside, his breath came slowly, measured, fragile, but his eyes were clearer than they had been in weeks. Sarah sat beside him, dozing in the vinyl chair with her Bible open on her lap. When he stirred, she woke instantly. Danny, she whispered, using his childhood name for the first time in years. I'm still here, he smiled faintly, but not for long. There was no fear in his voice, no trembling, only peace. For the first time in months, the spiritual war he had waged had ended, not in victory, but in surrender. At 6:30 a.m., Father Rodriguez arrived as he had every morning since their reconciliation video. Sometimes they prayed together. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence. But this morning felt different. Sarah opened the door and nodded toward the bed. Inside, Daniel looked up and offered a weak smile. You came. I told you I'd be here at the finish line. Father Rodriguez took his usual seat. They didn't speak for several minutes. They didn't need to. Then Daniel turned slightly toward the small framed image of Our Lady of Guadalupe still resting on his nightstand. Worn and faded, the same one Maria had left behind. I used to call her a myth, he whispered. The priest said nothing. But I think, Daniel continued, his voice growing fainter, she prayed for me anyway. He gazed toward the ceiling where morning light streamed through half-open blinds, painting his gaunt face in soft gold. "Do you believe," he asked, barely audible now, "that a mother ever stops praying for her children?" "Never," Father Rodriguez answered gently. "Not even once." Daniel nodded, his lips moving slow and deliberate. His final words came as a whisper, meant for ears both earthly and divine. "Virgencita, take me to your son." He died at 6:47 a.m., just as the sun rose over the city, and Catholic bells mingled with gospel hymns drifting from Sword of Truth revival across town. The timing was unplanned. The harmony was unmistakable. The funeral took place 4 days later in the Corpus Christi High School auditorium, neutral ground big enough for what had become a citywide act of healing. There was no denominational banner, no Protestant or Catholic symbols, just a simple wooden cross, and beneath it, two objects side by side, a worn Bible and a wooden rosary. The service was led jointly by Father Rodriguez and Pastor Elena Martinez, Daniel's longtime associate minister. They spoke not of doctrine, but of redemption, not of victory, but of peace. Carmen Vasquez sang Ave Maria in Spanish, her voice trembling with emotion. A young Catholic choir followed with Amazing Grace in English. The auditorium filled with both languages, both traditions, both sorrows becoming one. But the moment no one forgot happened after the final blessing. Roberto Sandoval stood beside his mother and held up a handwritten letter. "This is what Pastor Stone wrote me," he said, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. "The one where he said, 'Loving Christ never meant hurting the people who love you.'" He turned to Maria, tears streaming down his face. "Gracias por no rendirte conmigo, mamá. Thank you for not giving up on me." She took his hand, and together they placed the letter beneath the cross at the front of the stage. That night, as candles flickered on altars across the city for Dia de los Muertos, someone placed a single white rose beneath the statue of Our Lady outside Sacred Heart Parish. Taped beside it was a torn piece of notebook paper with these words, "I spent years shouting to God through a megaphone, but in the end, I only heard Him when I listened through a mother's prayer." Daniel Stone. In life, he was known as the man who spit at the Virgin. In death, he became the man who finally understood her silence. And in that silence, he found peace. Months passed. The hospital bed was gone, the flowers had withered, but the story, his story, refused to fade. In Corpus Christi, something had taken root that couldn't be explained by theology or tradition alone. Something that neither seminary nor sanctuary had ever quite achieved, a softening. Two churches, once defined by opposition, now held monthly joint prayer vigils. Children who had once been taught, "They're not like us," now played hand in hand in Sunday school rooms. The local food bank overflowed each weekend with volunteers wearing both crucifixes and Jesus Saves t-shirts side by side. It wasn't perfect. Old wounds take time to heal completely. But the dividing line had been blurred by something no theological debate could destroy. Compassion lived out in ordinary moments. In a small office at Sword of Truth Revival, tucked between boxes of old sermon recordings and outdated promotional flyers, Daniel's leather-bound notebook sat displayed under glass. Visitors still came to see it, not always to cry, sometimes just to read. They lingered especially over the final entry, written in shaky handwriting on the last day he could still hold a pen. "If I could preach one final sermon, it wouldn't be about Mary or doctrine or getting the gospel perfectly right. It would be about sitting across from someone you once called wrong and listening anyway. Because, in the end, it wasn't theology that saved me. It was mercy. No signature, just a trembling initial." Di Maria Sandoval continued leading her small interfaith prayer circle from her living room every Wednesday evening. Catholics and Protestants gathered around her kitchen table, sharing coffee and testimonies that would have been impossible just a year before. When asked why she kept hosting mixed groups, she simply said, "Because Pastor Stone taught me something no priest ever did." "What's that?" someone asked. "That sometimes the greatest act of faith is forgiving someone who thinks you're lost." Father Rodriguez remained at Sacred Heart, but his homilies had changed, Less fire, more grace. He still quoted scripture, but now he paired it with questions like, have you really listened to someone who believes differently than you, without planning your rebuttal? And at the end of each Mass, just before the final blessing, he would often add, let's not just be right, let's be kind. Even the younger generation felt the shift. Roberto Sandoval now studied pastoral counseling at a seminary in San Antonio, his calling shaped by watching hatred transform into healing. I used to think truth was something you shouted, he told his classmates. But Pastor Stone showed me it's also something you whisper into someone's pain. He kept Daniel's letter folded in his Bible, yellowing now, but the words hadn't lost their power. A real man doesn't have to choose between faith and family. Carmen Vasquez started a support group for people navigating religious transitions. Every Thursday night, former Catholics learning Protestant theology sat beside ex-evangelicals exploring Marian devotion. We're all just trying to find God, she would say to open each meeting. Maybe he's big enough for all of us to be right about something. The cemetery where Daniel was buried became an unexpected pilgrimage site, not for miracles or visions, but for the simple granite headstone that read, Daniel Matthew Stone, 1969 to 2014. Grace found me when pride let go. Beside his grave stood a small statue, not of Christ, as many might expect, but of Mary. Simple, peaceful, her hands folded in prayer. Every few days, someone would place a single white rose at her feet. No one knew who, but the flowers kept coming. White roses and handwritten notes tucked beneath them. Thank you for showing us it's okay to change our minds. I'm sorry for the things I said about your mother, Jesus. Help me listen like you listened to him. The local newspaper ran a feature story on the first anniversary of Daniel's death, titled The Miracle of Corpus Christi. But those who lived through it knew better. It wasn't really a miracle. It was just what happened when people stopped shouting long enough to hear each other's hearts breaking. What Daniel Stone left behind wasn't a church movement or a theological revolution. It was something quieter, something stronger. Proof that love really could heal more than any argument ever would. It didn't always shout from pulpits or shine through stained glass windows. Sometimes it just showed up with a cracked picture frame and a forgiving heart and said, let's walk together. In a world that seemed to grow louder and more divided with each passing year, the little city of Corpus Christi held on to something precious. The memory of a man who learned to whisper prayers instead of shouting sermons. And in that whisper, he found what had been missing all along. He found home. If this story of redemption, forgiveness, and unexpected grace touched your heart, remember that the most powerful sermons are often lived rather than preached. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit we were wrong. Sometimes the holiest act is simply showing up with love when someone least expects it. The walls that divide us are never stronger than the mercy that can heal us, if we're brave enough to let it.